I have, for the longest time, invested myself in what are creepypastas. Although the name has begun to lose its mark on the world nowadays, back then it was a staple for horror on the internet. These short stories of gruesome and frightening tales were a perfect lure to my childish mind. I remember listening to these audio tales of old creepypastas and reading them, despite my childish fear of each and every one being a real story to be concerned about. I remember fondly of moments where I would stay awake at night, fearing that old characters like Jeff the Killer or Eyeless Jack were in my room, waiting to attack me at any second if I dared to close my eyes. Thankfully, those were all fake, and I didn't have to worry about anything harming me, except for one monster. Out of all the creepypasta slashers and creatures I had heard of, there was always this one that stuck out to me like a sore thumb. This little creature was one that I was always the most afraid of as a child, and was for the longest time. Even mentions of their name made some nerve in me tingle in distress. As I've now grown up, I, of course, am a lot less frightened by such a name and story, but I will never forget how much I used to get scared by such a creature. That creepypasta character I speak of is a little creature, known only as Mr. Widemouth. Mr. Widemouth is an old creepypasta dated back since almost the beginning of the creepypasta genre itself. The story isn't as scary as it is in its concept, and how it makes you feel like you are on your toes the entire time. It is about our narrator describing his life at such a young age, coming down with a horrible illness that keeps him bedridden, when he meets a strange and frightening creature called Mr. Widemouth, who insists on becoming our narrator's friend. It lists the passing of days and the many games Mr. Widemouth wishes to play with our narrator, and the intimidating behaviors of these games and the creature himself, who wants much more than just to play with our narrator. The story is fantastical in how it gives you tension as the reader, with the many tricks Mr. Widemouth throws at our narrator, and how it forces this looming danger upon you throughout the entire story. But what it exceeds at the most is preying off the fears of our childish minds. The story takes everything a child would be thinking and doing and makes the most to create such a frightening tale. This was why I used to be so afraid of this story, and Mr. Widemouth himself, because of how it fed off my growing mind. That is what I plan to discuss in this video. I'm going to be sharing how this old creepypasta does a phenomenal job at taking advantage of children's minds, and using it to craft something so scary, and why I believe it is the best example of preying on the weaknesses of being a child. So, without further ado, let's dive in. Before I dive into why the tale is great at taking advantage of the concept of a child's mind, I want to go over the initial story first, since I'm certain many people don't know it or have forgotten the events that take place in it. Our protagonist of the story is our narrator, who recalls the events of his younger life during the age of 5. As a child, he was always moving around with his parents from state to state so their father could manage work for them. Because of this, they were never stationary, and our narrator couldn't make friends or adapt to his life. Things got worse for our author, as when they were about to move out of their current home at the time, a small mansion in New Vineyard, Maine, our author came down with a terrible illness. Mononucleosis, to be specific. This, added on to the fact that they were on the verge of moving, meant our author was bedridden in what was practically an empty room, with nothing in it. Being trapped in a room with no windows and a dreary gray color is something that makes me shiver by simply perceiving the concept, especially the claustrophobic nature that room must have felt for the weeks the author stayed in there. The author then does a very off-putting skip in the story. They list that they met Mr. Widemouth within the first few days of the illness, but leaves out how it happened, putting it off as a "I can't remember" scenario. This alone is a great method of immediately getting to the horror. Jumping to the sudden arrival of Mr. Widemouth not only matches with the idea of a lost memory in a child's mind, adapting as they grow up, but it throws the reader right into what they can expect to experience in this story. They give a description of Mr. Widemouth, listing him as a monster with short limbs and crooked ears, and a grin that was massive and disturbing to look at, soon boiling down to a simple description of resembling a Furby, which that alone is enough to make me afraid. because Furbies are devilish creatures that need to be burned one by one. Anyways, Mr. Widemouth acts very tame during the first few days alongside our sick narrator, not doing a whole lot besides reading the books their mother brings them while bedridden. One day, however, Mr. Widemouth greets the narrator with the idea of a game they could play together. He tells them, however, that they must wait until it is slightly dark, and until their mother leaves them be. The narrator, being bored, accepts the offer. Once night begins to roll around, Mr. Widemouth leads our protagonist out of their bed and to the room next door. This is where the story begins to send shivers down my spine. Our protagonist is brought to a room, barren with gray walls and nothing in it apart from a window at the opposite end of the room. The environment here may be described in only a sentence, but the concept of a room as bleak and dreary when imagined sets a tone that something awful is going to transpire. Mr. Widemouth pushes open the window and invites the protagonist over. Below them was a massive incline, barely visible whilst being 2 stories high in their own home. Mr. Widemouth begins telling our protagonist that below this window, down deep past the incline, was a trampoline created by their imagination alone. If they believed hard enough, they could land on the trampoline and bounce right back up to the window, safe and sound. This is the first sign of Mr. Widemouth's deception, as he tries to convince our main character to leap out of their window to, what we know, is imminent death. This description terrified me as a kid. I have always been afraid of great heights, and I never dared to approach a window upstairs of my own house as a kid because of this story. Mr. Widemouth is taking advantage of a child, a simple-minded human, and promising that there is a safe haven below this massive drop. Thankfully, our author refuses the beast's request, believing that he doesn't have enough imagination to summon a trampoline. Mr. Widemouth snarls at the kid, disappointingly making their way back to their room and hiding under the bed for the rest of the night. The next morning, Mr. Widemouth returns with a new game for the two to play. This time, he brings along a small cardboard box, telling the protagonist that he wishes to teach them to juggle. Our author is fine with the idea at first, but is caught off guard when he opens the box only to find it full of knives. Instinctively, and being the good child he is, rejects the offer to try juggling and kicks the box away, believing their mother would punish them if she found the box. Once again, Mr. Widemouth's plans were foiled, thus making him hide away once more to contemplate another plan. Over time, Mr. Widemouth attempts to influence awful game ideas onto our narrator, rejected each time it is done. The story doesn't list much more past this point, but it does mention that Mr. Widemouth often wakes up our protagonists in their sleep, convincing them that he put an actual trampoline below the window and the deep incline. Like last time, our protagonist rejects the offer, but Mr. Widemouth, as the days proceed forward, begins to grow more passive-aggressive, spending entire nights beckoning the author to do these unwanted things and staying awake night after night, watching them menacingly. One day, our protagonist finally gets permission to wander outside due to his condition growing better. While enjoying this warm sun and cool breeze of the wind, Mr. Widemouth arrives once more and leads our protagonist to a forest trail towards the back of their home's massive yard. It led deep into a small forest, going on for a long way. Mr. Widemouth tells our protagonist that he brings all the children he meets down this path to a very special place. He states that our main character isn't ready to see what is at the other end, but he will soon enough. After this, our author begins to recover from mononucleosis, and the family begins to finish packing their things and move once more. However, our protagonist doesn't believe Mr. Widemouth would be too keen on letting him leave so soon. But with his menacing manner and malicious intent now visible at this point in the story, he knew staying may become an awful decision. So, our protagonist makes the smart move of making their leave a secret. The next day, the family packs their things in their truck and as their father drives them all off to their new home. But as they leave the driveway, our protagonist spots Mr. Widemouth sitting at the bedroom window with a steak knife in hand, waving goodbye to their friend. Our author refusing to wave back. The story time skips to our author now, a full adult, returning to the old home that Mr. Widemouth and his illness transpired in, only to learn it had burned down to a crisp years ago. Nothing remained of it. Our protagonist then remembers the deer trail in the back, which still exists after all these years, and follows it to the end. It leads them to the new vineyard graveyard, and here we find out most of the gravestones belong to young children. It's a very simple story that brings a scare in a way that one struggles to imagine. The fear of this story doesn't come from the environment or its short but effective description nature, but rather its uncanny relatability. We have all been a child once in our lives, and I can guarantee that most of my viewers have dealt with the uncontrollable urge as a child to disobey parents' requests and mess with dangerous things. This story takes those to the extreme by having Mr. Widemouth use the simple minds of children as his prey, and takes advantage of it in hopes that they end up accidentally killing themselves, unknowingly, of the harm that they are causing themselves. It not only keeps you on your toes, but keeps you invested. And the ending delivers such a phenomenal twist to the story. When I first read it, I believed that everything our protagonist was experiencing was a hallucination due to his illness, with Mr. Widemouth being an imaginary friend. However, the last line talks about the graveyard being full of children's graves is shocking. All of this was real, and our protagonist's life was on the line the whole time. Just reading the story, however, and understanding the scenario is just the tip of the iceberg. The fear of this story, when scratched down and willed to its end, has a disturbing nature and truth, one that reveals how sensible we are when young, and how this story abuses those senses to its limits. With your minds refreshed on the story itself, I want to take the time to explain how it excels in delivering a good scare, and pushes our ideas of being young to its limit. When you first hear me say the term, a child's mindset, what do you see? Maybe a reflection of your own childhood? More likely than not, you are thinking about how innocent you were, how ridiculously imaginative you used to be. In an entertaining way, of course. You probably had an imaginative friend, or dreamt of being something great in the future. As children, we are sensible beings that don't quite understand how life works. That last part right there, that is what this story uses to create its horror. I want to go back to when our protagonist first met Mr. Widemouth at the foot of their bed, and why I first believed that this creature was a figment of their imagination. If you have ever been sick as a child, then you know how painful it may feel to be stuck inside. Now think of it this way, being sick as a child in a practically empty room, no windows, with no toys, objects of interest, and a blank room. That was what our protagonists had to go through in this story. They felt isolated while being contagious with such a severe illness inside such an empty space. The only form of entertainment they had were the books and drinks their mother brought them every day. Obviously, they would get bored, but more or less feel alone. I figured days of being alone made them want a friend to help them through. This is why I used to believe that Mr. Widemouth was just an imaginative creature at first. After all, imaginary friends are a coping mechanism that helps some children when they feel alone. But when the story begins to reveal the dark nature of Mr. Widemouth, his murderous intent, and the fact that he has slaughtered so many injured innocent children before him, throws this idea out of the window. Instead, the story focuses on using a child to their advantage in a much different way. Mr. Widemouth is an unknowingly clever character at best. He's small, but very crafty. Instead of choosing to try and kill our protagonist right away, or with a weapon, he prioritizes on using the protagonist's childish nature to have them kill themselves. The window scene is the best example of this. The moment Mr. Widemouth even attempts to invite our protagonist to the next room over, we can tell he is plotting something. Once we hear of the long drop that is below the 2-story high window, and the game begins to be explained, our senses immediately begin to trigger in a worrisome way. Taking the idea of what I said about children being prone to influence into account, this is a frighteningly perfect way for Mr. Widemouth to try and get our protagonist to kill himself. This is doubled by the fact that Mr. Widemouth tells our author to imagine a trampoline below, and adding on that he himself has done it before, and has seemingly lived. All of these may be lies, but nonetheless, it is worded in a way where it is meant to influence our main character into jumping to their death, almost like a mother calling out to their baby. Our main character may have survived this event, but this part of the story carries a whole darker meaning than what it already does when you learn of the ending, and that Mr. Widemouth had done this before with many other children he had killed. Perhaps not every child was killed by leaping out a tall window, but it's safe to assume each successful murder was done by convincing each kid to attempt something seemingly fun and safe, only to fall to a quick death. I can honestly imagine Mr. Widemouth convincing a 4-year-old to run around with scissors until he falls and punctures himself. This isn't even the only method we know he tries on our protagonist. Later in the story, he tries to convince our protagonist to juggle knives. The way he plays it off goes along with how he manipulates little kids to attempt such heinous actions. He gently slides the box our protagonist's way, says he will be right back to grab another box, but he can get started practicing if he wants to. We, as kids, are naturally curious. Learning is one of our biggest key instincts that stays our whole lives, but acts the most prominent as the kid. If our protagonist didn't know what knives were, I am positive he would have taken up the chance to screw around with them, perhaps even lethally wound himself as well. Knowing that Mr. Widemouth has multiple different tricks up his sleeves to convince little children to accidentally off themselves shows his great dedication to this. It's unknown why, but this alone shows us as the reader how vulnerable we used to be. At the time when I was young, it was the reason I got so afraid of the story and Mr. Widemouth himself. I was a child who had grown up enough to understand the fears of being used, especially where they could potentially hurt me. That idea, in my mind, scared the living hell out of me, and it's what kept me awake at night after night. I never had a full understanding of who we are as kids, and what our limits were. A creature such as Mr. Widemouth being there to take advantage of that to a point where we could die is frightening, because if we were in those dead children's shoes, we wouldn't understand what was going on, or even how wrong all of this was to us. That is why I believe this story does the best job at trying to take advantage of child's fears and weaknesses, because it doesn't hide what it is meant to represent. It shows that our curiosity and imaginative beliefs can be our own downfall if somebody taught us the wrong way, to a point where we may lose our own lives in the heat of the moment. I know that is not a common thing, but there are real-life examples of exactly this in the real world. Children losing their lives because they don't know any better, to where it's even shown in movies, TV shows, and even video games. Things like the Babadook, or even Poppy Playtime come to mind with these concepts. However, I believe wholeheartedly that this creepypasta does the best job at bringing this concept to life as a real threat for a horror story. I know that isn't a pleasant concept, but with how real and mentally driving it is as one, it does a phenomenal job at being exactly what the story is trying to be. If the plot of the story and the method of Mr. Widemouth's murders were different, they would be nowhere as effective as they are. Honestly, if Mr. Widemouth wasn't a part of the story, this entire concept would be thrown out the window, because he is the source of the idea that one can take advantage of children's thoughts and curiosities. While I'm at it, I have said what I have to about the concept of using a child's weaknesses and thoughts to dangerous intentions. I want to take the time in the next segment to talk specifically about Mr. Widemouth as a monster, and how perfect he is for this kind of story. His role and implications are way too important to shove aside. I want to start this segment by mentioning Mr. Widemouth's appearance. We aren't told a lot about who Mr. Widemouth really is in this story, as a lot of it is up to the reader's interpretation to picture him and how he behaves. The only solid confirmation of Mr. Widemouth's appearance is that he looks like a Furby, but with short limbs and a massive smile that stretches around most of his face. This ominous description is all we get of the little guy, and it creates this sense of mystery to him. The unconfirmable nature of this character's full identity is one of the biggest factors that makes him a monster to be afraid of in the first place. Remember how I said he seemed a lot like an imaginative friend? That trope stays with the way he is pictured in our heads, that can either be a more of a scary character, or a more childish looking beast, to better befriend the children they slaughter. When I was making the thumbnail for this video, I wanted to make sure I had drawn Mr. Widemouth in a way where it would share the qualities that a majority of all the people who interpret the creature would enjoy. There is plenty of art of Mr. Widemouth on the internet, and nobody can truly agree on what he looks like either. Some picture him with a beak, others give him visible legs, while some just give him stubbed feet. Honestly, the many variations I've seen are what trigger me to say what I say here. Because of their full form is kept ambiguous, we begin to wonder and worry what they may really look like. That itself is frightening, and it's one of the many reasons I was so scared of the beast as a kid. Another thing that this creature deserves to be praised for is the way he communicates to his future victims. And I don't mean with his voice, because unlike his appearance, it is unarguable that Jonathan Jones is the canonical voice for Mr. Widemouth.
I like to play pretend up here. I pretend there's a big, soft trampoline below this window, and I jump. If you pretend hard enough, you bounce back up like a feather. I want you to try.
I mean with the way he lures them and gets them to trust him. At the start of the story, when our protagonist mentions that Mr. Widemouth resembles a furry, he immediately tells them that they don't need one because he has them. It's quick, but he doesn't hesitate to establish subtly that he puts his quote-unquote trust in them, and that our protagonist should do the same. We can also assume that he spends time learning about his victims and what they enjoy to better find a method of safely killing them. With our protagonist, he doesn't have to do that, because they are under a deep illness that are left them with practically nothing in the room apart from books. This gives Mr. Widemouth the excuse to use almost anything to try and appeal to our author, while also trying to off them. And what he does use were very clever choices. Using the house to his advantage and the massive incline beneath it to kill them was a clever choice on his behalf. And the thought of juggling knives may not have been the smartest, but it was a great way to deliver a quick moment of tension in the story. But I believe the best part about Mr. Widemouth is the way he shares his emotions throughout the story. I adore how you can read in the words of the story his decline into desperation to kill this child. When our protagonist first meets Mr. Widemouth and begins befriending him for the next few days, Mr. Widemouth focuses on trying to make sure that our author trusts them and can treat them as a friend. This way, and then use it to learn about his target and find a way to eliminate them. When they end up beginning to play their game in the next room over where the window is, he beckons them to jump in hopes that it will work. But when our protagonist refuses to jump, there is a brief line that mentions Mr. Widemouth begin to grow frustrated, only for it to die down in disappointment. For just the briefest of moments, Mr. Widemouth's true intentions were revealed, and his emotions stepped through, before a mask covered them back up once more. It's a subtle hint that at Mr. Widemouth's devilish side, and what it will grow into later in the story. Mr. Widemouth demotes his time and effort while our protagonist is trying to sleep to keep him awake and pressure him to try the window game again. So much so, he keeps them awake overnight and watches them sleep. This is the part that made me afraid of Mr. Widemouth, and not just him watching me sleep, even though that is something I am very much afraid of. I mean in terms of his sinister desire to make sure he is getting his way no matter what. I ask you, why would he be getting so mad in the first place? Think of it in his shoes. Mr. Widemouth has killed kid after kid successfully without a single issue. To suddenly have a kid, who's miraculously being smart in nature compared to all the other dumbfounded people he has convinced to harm themselves, must be extremely sudden and frustrating to him, to a point where he has begun to despise them and become desperate to where he will stop at nothing to try and get rid of them. This is shown in the final bits of the story. When our protagonists began driving away from their home, Mr. Widemouth is seen sitting at the window of their bedroom with a steak knife in their hands. This alone shows he was about to finish the job himself because nothing else was working the way he wanted it to. Mr. Widemouth then and there decided to try and take matters into his own hands, only to fail when they found their victim leaving the house. If our author didn't decide to not tell Mr. Widemouth of his leave, he would most likely be dead meat by now. This is the last time we see Mr. Widemouth in the story, and oh boy is it a perfect place to finish it. The story and how it builds Mr. Widemouth is phenomenal, and how it crafts him as an indescribable beast with a clever mind that gets riled up when things don't go his way. It's a monster that is deservingly fun on one half, and frighteningly scary on the other. The way he is built up as a monster is perfect, and I wouldn't want him in any other way. If he were part of the story, I highly doubt it would work in the first place. His inclusion is what brings this tale together, and makes him one of the best creepypasta characters out there, that definitely deserves much more attention. In fact, the entire story itself is golden for what it is. All of these factors combined, Mr. Widemouth's character, the way he takes advantage of his victims, and how he shows the susceptibility of children can be used for such a shivering tale, all boils down to one great thing. This is why I adore this creepypasta the most out of the many others out there in the world. When I was young, it accomplished its goal of shaking me in a way where I felt afraid, to a point where I would stay awake at night, fearing for Mr. Widemouth himself. But when I grew up and revisited myself in the story, I found out how phenomenal it truly was as one. All these elements were written perfectly in a way that built a tale that may not be scary for many, but has a dark truth that come together into a short and savoringly sweet story. I'm going to be honest, I'm glad this was one of the most impactful creepypastas during my childhood, or I never would have returned to talk about it like I am right now. The way it stuck with me for so long is something special that not a lot of stories have managed to do for me in a long time. I know I may be exaggerating, but trust me when I say that this story is one of the biggest reasons I want to make this video. Hell, even this channel in the first place. It gives me a sense of inspiration that nobody else seems to experience. So talking about it here felt like a perfect way to start something on the internet, and get people to explore this story and other ones that make them feel a sense of scary nostalgia. Not everyone will be intrigued in these kinds of tales, and that's fine. I just hope that this concept can be used much more in horror stories, as it's a concept I adore greatly. I know there are some forms of media out there that indulge into this type of horror, but it's a scarce amount at best. That is why I'm hoping this video will come to light for a select majority, or even more. I would love to see this concept spread and see where it goes. That effect will take some time, but I can't wait to see where it goes. And I will be spending that waiting time preparing my next video for you all, in hopes that it will do the same. So, without further ado, I believe it is time to say my farewells. This is Psychedia, and I thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Farewell, for now.